Magnificent sound. My name's Ebony Bennett. I'm Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to Politics in the Pub for September. Thanks for coming out on this, frankly, bloody freezing Canberra night. I'm not sure if you're like me, but I'm really quite ready for spring to start properly at the moment. And as always, I get trapped and hoodwinked by fake spring, and I put away my jackets and then it gets cold again. So thank you so much for coming out. I want to acknowledge that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I also want to remind you that it is the Australia Institute's 30th anniversary in 2024. And if you would like to chip in to fund research that matters, we've got a bit of a donation box at the back and a reminder that you can donate on our website at australiainstitute.org.au. And as part of our 30th anniversary celebrations, we have brought and are bringing a series of some of the world's greatest thinkers to Australia to really honour the Australia Institute's legacy of bringing 30 years of bringing big ideas to the Australian political debate. So we've hosted Yanis Varoufakis in March and Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz in August, and next month we'll be hosting freedom fighter, Nobel Peace Prize winner and the President of Timor-Leste, Jose Ramos Horta. He'll be joining us for a special evening at the Sydney Opera House on Tuesday the 8th of October, and I encourage you all to check that out, and please come along if you can. It's sure to be a really special event. So I did want to welcome you all for what I am hoping will be a fabulous evening on one of my favourite topics this evening, and I'd like to welcome Royce Kurmelovs, the author of Slick, Australia's Toxic Relationship with Big Oil. Please give him a big round of applause. And before we get going, our friends at Paper Chain Bookstore in Manuka are selling copies of Royce's book, so you can grab a copy there and he'll be signing books afterwards. That's right, isn't it, Royce?
Correct, yes.
And so Royce is a journalist, and you might have read his work in Rolling Stone Australia, The Guardian, The Saturday Paper, Vice, and many other newspapers and magazines. And he is doing the rounds with this latest book, Slick, and he's got a couple of other books as well. His first best-selling book was The Death of Holden, and his critically acclaimed fourth book, Just Money, Misadventures in the Australian Debt Trap, was published in 2020. But tonight we are talking about Slick and Australia's toxic relationship with big oil. And the book exposes the global oil industry's multi-decade conspiracy to muddy the waters around the science of climate change. Does that sound familiar to anyone? In a week where Australia's Environment Minister has approved not one, not two, but 3 coal mine expansions in the Hunter Valley, we can see the pernicious influence of the fossil fuel lobby again. But Royce, I wanted to start out where you started the book, which is with the impacts of climate change and the fossil fuel industry and the Lismore floods. Why did you decide to start the book there?
Yeah, and also I should say, thank you so much for having me here today. It's so nice to be in Canberra with all of you. You guys know how to throw a party, so it's nice to be here. So the book was it was really important to me as part of the book to move away from kind of the very crunchy, wonky way of talking about climate change that sometimes develops when we talk about this. And so right up the top, right up the front, one of the first stories I tell in the book is about a woman, Kate Stroud, who survived the Lismore flood. This is a woman who is in her 30s, she's made decisions in her life, and she turned up to this place, and she was just kind of getting everything going when this massive catastrophic flood, hit this region. And for her, this was this was a hugely traumatic effect. She was not the only story, by the way. There were several others I spoke to, but hers was the one. She was the most comfortable talking about what she was doing. But also for her story was a really good way of making the stakes really clear, of making the human cost of this issue really plain up front, so that when we talk about climate change, when we talk about the fossil fuel companies and their role in this and their role in disinformation, that we know exactly what it is we're talking about. And for me, when I was listening to her speak, when I was interviewing her over a period of, I spoke to her for many hours actually, she described how, she had this house in a part of Lismore that was supposed to be safe, They had done all the right things. They had chosen the right house. The house was raised. It was supposed to be fine. They'd been through another flood. The flood went underneath. It was all good. This time around, and all the alarms said, oh no, the flood will pass you by. And then suddenly at 3 a.m., everything changed, almost on a dime. And then suddenly, her and her partner are sitting there watching, going, oh no, the water's going to come into the house. It's coming up the back step as we speak. And so they started lifting all their furniture up. And they were doing this over a period of hours as the morning unwound. And this is a Monday morning. And so, and as this kind of chocolate-covered mud soup seeps up through their floorboards, they realize that it's all for nothing. And as day breaks, as Kate should be getting ready to go to work, is to go into town, her partner says, hold on a minute, do you hear that sound? And she goes, what sound? And he goes, is that a cow? And she's like, I hope not. And they look out their window where across the road from their house, what was once a park, but was now a lake, was filling up with water. And there was this cow stuck in a tree because it had been swept from a field and pushed this far into Lismore. And then it was dislodged and slammed up against the wall, the railing of their house where they lived. And as they went out to kind of look at them to see the situation and see what was going on, there was this creature just kind of staring at them. And she describes it as it was looking at her in the eyes and saying, help me, help me, help me. You have to help me. And at that point, she just froze because everything about the situation was so topsy-turvy, was upside down, was so unreal that she couldn't process it. And, and for her, this was kind of like, again, this completely absurd moment that really encapsulated the situation. And I remember being so moved by this story that it just kind of exemplified this whole moment, this whole piece. And so for me, when I went away and started doing the kind of like the legwork, the archival research to piece together what happened in the story, that was always in the back of my mind, that the implication of all these kind of dry policy documents, these kind of bragging histories you get from the industry, these kind of internal memos and letters, that is the implication. That is the cost of those decisions and that delay.
Yeah, because often it's so divorced from the consequences of mining and burning fossil fuels. But obviously a huge part of the book is the long relationship between the oil and gas industry and the politics of climate denial. So can you give us a little bit of an idea about whether either in Australia's oil companies or globally, I mean, how early did these companies know that they were causing climate change and what was their response?
Well, I mean, most people in this room will be familiar with this history up to an extent, right? This idea that Exxon knew or the oil companies knew at some point. But when we talk about what happened, we talk about how, often the conversation focuses on kind of the mid-2000s when the politics really heated up. It talks about the 90s when kind of some of this early stuff was going on. And sometimes it goes back to the 80s. But when we have this kind of concept of Exxon knew, it's not really clear what that means or what the story is or what actually happened. And also, that conversation, when it does happen, tends to be about the US and Europe. And so what shocked me, what surprised me, is just how far back this went. When you start looking for, like, at what point did these people know there was a risk from extracting and burning fossil fuels? It's not just the 90s, it's not just the 80s, it's not just the 70s. In Australia, it's the 70s, but it goes even further back. And the story is actually incredible, right? So the actual science of the greenhouse effect. I mean, there were people were talking about this theoretically for hundreds of years. The first person to describe it was a female scientist that got no recognition for her work in this area, as you may expect. But it was actually the person that actually kind of put two and two together, this idea that burning fossil fuels has a tangible effect on the climate, was one scientist in Los Angeles who in the 1940s, who was, 'cause everyone was freaking out about the smog above the city, this idea that this all-encompassing, like, horrible pollution that was making people, cry as they moved between buildings, forcing people to wear gas masks in the street, that maybe this would happen to every city on the planet. And this guy looked at the couple million cars on Los Angeles roads, looked at the sky and kind of went, oh, I see a connection here, and then did the work and then made that connection and freaked out the automotive industry, who attacked him in a way that is very familiar to the way that the oil companies later attacked climate scientists more broadly. And then you had the next thing happen, which was tobacco was around. And so tobacco, a couple of scientists swabbed the back of some mice and it grew some tumors. And then everyone was like, well, and that then was the first evidence of the connection between smoking and cancer. And at that point, the tobacco industry started to face lawsuit after lawsuit and political pressure over the risk between cancer and smoking. And as all this was going on, in the background, you have the US oil industry. And they're watching this. They're, on the one hand, they've got the kind of automotive guys. On the other hand, they've got the tobacco guys. And they're putting two and two together and saying, right, well, if there's this thing called the greenhouse effect and there's this combustion stuff, and we're providing the petrol and the diesel and everything else that creates that, and our friends in tobacco are getting sued into oblivion by all these people, eventually when they work out that we're responsible for this, they're going to come for us. And so at that point, they started doing active research. They started hiring scientists to do studies, internal studies that they never shared with anyone. And so out of this, you get the most extraordinary statements. You get these statements from these scientists saying that this is the greatest experiment humanity is playing with its environment ever. You get these other internal reports warning that there's going to be a disastrous result if we keep going. And this is where Australia comes into the picture, because this is all America so far. But where Australia comes in is that we were desperate to set up an oil industry. It was 1953 when we found the first oil here, but the Australians couldn't get off the ground. They needed help. They needed American might, a technical know-how, and specifically American finance to get off the ground. And so they all went to the US, they all made friends, they all came back, and then they used that American technical expertise and finance to underwrite a massive expansion at this time. And so at that moment you have the oil industry is aware that there's a risk and there's a risk of harm, and yet it continues this massive expansion regardless. And even the Australian government gets warned about this. There's a Senate committee. One of the first joint Senate select committees in the country is into air pollution. And one of them is there's this Tasmanian scientist who stands up in front of this hearing and says, this is one of the biggest issues going forward. Everyone keeps talking about air pollution, but this carbon dioxide stuff, this is a real big issue. We've got to get across this. You've got to fund us to be able to research this. No one's talking about CO2. No one's talking about the greenhouse effect. We should be. This is going to be really, really bad. We need to know more right now. And then his evidence then gets turned into the opening state of this Senate Select Committee report on air pollution that is that says that humanity is turning the atmosphere into a giant garbage dump, which is an extraordinary statement to make from an Australian government body at that particular period, given everything else we know that happens. And so that was 1969, I believe. And then on top of that, so the next year in the timeline is 1972, and that's where you have at that point the Australian coal producers, the Australian oil producers, gas producers, they're all getting together. They're all freaked out by this talk because they want to make a bunch of money, and they're worried about all this environmental concern. There was an attempt to drill the Great Barrier Reef that freaked them out, and the pushback freaked them out. Sorry, and so they flew in some experts to talk about what climate change was and to give this kind of lecture. And then on the floor of the Australian Petroleum Exploration Association's national conference in 1972, you have another scientist stands up and just lays out the science as plain as day, saying that this is going to be a significant issue. We've got to keep across this going forward. And he was saying that to advocate on behalf of the gas industry. So all that rhetoric you hear going currently about how gas is a bridging fuel and it's a cleaner fuel, that was already being said in 1972. So there's nothing new under the sun. But that was the year that we currently know when they were aware that this was a risk, and then everything that happened afterwards shows that they went ahead regardless of that risk. And I think that was part of the point of the book, to really to highlight that lesson. Yeah,
it came through really clearly. You can read some of those old documents and things that you've unearthed and the old quotes from the conferences, and it's the exact same language as we hear now.
Absolutely, and it's shocking, and it's like, and it's not just the rhetoric that hasn't changed. Also, the tactics are the same. So and part of the book was not just about climate change and when this industry knew, but it was also about influence and about kind of this idea of state capture and how does that work, and how does how does influence work? Like we hear terms like the revolving door and donations and all this sorts of stuff and transparency, but in terms of looking at how it operates, I was really curious to see, well, how and when did it begin? And you get interesting examples, like for instance, with the oil industry. Early on, there was, when they started doing the national conferences, they branded their conferences as meetings of scientists, because that was how they wanted to get people on board. But the Australian government had a government department that had a government geologists. And these geologists were banned from hanging out at the conferences because the government was like, right, well, we don't want you to get divided loyalties. If you go hang out with these oil guys, maybe you'll go to work for them and you'll be working for them and not us, and that's a problem. You can't go. And the oil industry was really freaked out and really mad about this. So their way around it was very creative and very sneaky. They went up to, like, there was a guy who went up to them and said, listen, this ban of yours only applies to the conference. It doesn't apply to drinks. Why don't you come to the bar afterwards and, oh, by the way, the boss will be there? And that's how they got around the ban. And so even in that moment, you have that very first example of a campaign to use influence to kind of bend, to work around the rules, to kind of ingratiate themselves with people in order to kind of, to get their way, to achieve the outcomes they want, to make the friends in the right places that they need to make things happen.
I really encourage people to buy the book because it will make you so angry at all of these tactics that they've used so effectively. But you did talk about the Great Barrier Reef there, and I'm just kind of a bit curious. I'd like to ask you kind of a little bit about that campaign and the impact that it had. But hands up, people, if you actually think if there was like a proposal today for gas or something like that under the Great Barrier Reef or oil, do you think we've got a better chance now of turning that kind of thing on its head or back then? Because I just kind of feel like if we didn't have the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park and other things, like, I just feel like there's no governments that stand up to the fossil fuel industry much anymore.
Well, yeah, and I mean, that was born out of, basically you had Joe Bjelke-Petersen, Australia's kind of eternal arch villain, the kind of atavistic representation of everything terrible, kind of opened up the entire Queensland coast and said, guys, let rip. We want oil extraction, we want gas extraction, go nuts. And a bunch of companies were quite happy to oblige. If you ask them directly, they would say, oh, no one wants to drill directly on the Great Barrier Reef. It's a national treasure. Why would we want to do that? We just want to drill next door, And when you had an organization like Appia, it was set up specifically to respond to those sorts of situations. And so I'm getting ahead of myself. And so once this plan was announced, to kind of drill nearby the Great Barrier Reef, you had instant reaction. You had the creation of the Australian Conservation Society. You had instant pushback from the union movement. You had this kind of real intense opposition of people rightly saying that you cannot do this. You cannot risk this pristine place. People were aware of the oil spills that had happened. They were aware that there was there was these terrible situations that were occurred overseas, to the extent where the UK government air bombed a leaking tanker and tried to set it on fire with a napalm because they didn't know how to deal with it at that point. But that opposition that formed, that coalesced, terrified the industry. And so when you had an organization like Appia at the time, one of its remits was to deal in legal representation. And so they mobilized. They sent the hat around, everyone put some money in, and then they used that money to represent themselves at a royal commission that was eventually called into this effect. And it didn't do much good, because the ultimate result of that royal commission was the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park and a ban on drilling in the area. But there was still this attempt to push their luck. And when you look at closely who was involved in that, one of the people who were involved in organizing that legal defense of the industry at that time would become a long-running supporter of the industry and a climate denier who was kind of popping up in press for the next 30 years. He went to work for the marketing department of, I think, I can't remember which company, But it was incredible for me, like learning about this and refining it and then attempting to present this, knowing that some of the characters that you see kind of causing a ruckus, in our time, have been around for a very, very long time and were very much involved in this from day one.
And a real deliberate recruitment strategy to recruit from the public service in particular, because those people also brought strong connections to government and were able to kind of alert the industry to potential regulation or laws that might impact them. And then, obviously the ability to try and influence that, which again, like I think you talk about the fact that some of those industry bodies have had to rebrand because they became so toxic over time. I think Appia has rebranded once again in the last couple of years.
Which I may or may not have something to do with, but I.
But tell us a little bit more about some of those tactics that they've employed, in particular against government, I guess.
Well, and just to go back to the kind of the rebrand stuff, I mean, that's a really important point and something worth drawing out. So basically, Appia was an organization for most of its history that were a bunch of engineers. And, as most people can kind of get from the stereotype of engineers, you put a bunch of them in the room, they have very strong opinions about things, they're very irascible and, but they're not very good at talking to the public. So they started trying to hire in people who were good at talking to the public. And they started with a former journalist at first, and then in the 90s they hired someone who was a former government bureaucrat. And he had the opportunity to completely remake the organization from the ground up and did so successfully. And part of his strategy was hiring from directly within government. And he went around and picked up former bureaucrats. And that was the kind of genesis of the strategy that continues today. And the reason why in doing that, he was enormously successful. Suddenly this institution that was being a little bit aggressive, a little bit prickly, a little bit difficult to deal with, a little bit self-serving, because everyone was kind of like, well, you're a bunch of oil and gas guys, of course you're going to say that. Suddenly they had this professional veneer. Suddenly they knew how to talk to government. They knew how to write policy documents. They knew the language. They knew the history. Because when you have people get hired into these industry associations, what you're doing is you're not just buying their skill set or their phone book. You're buying their awareness of the history, the context, and their successors, the people that replace them, don't know about the former battles that were fought, the former interactions, why decisions were made a certain way. And that means every interaction that they have with this institution becomes an ambush. And then, so in terms of the tactics that this trickles out into government, the 90s was a period as well where you really, where as this change takes place, you see this really aggressive recognition amongst industry broadly that they need to coordinate, that they need to collaborate, and then they need to work together towards a singular goal. And even if they might, individual companies don't always like each other, individual personalities don't always like each other, individual associations sometimes hate each other, but they recognize that if they wanted to achieve certain things, they need to keep it together long enough to achieve that goal. And so you start to see these kind of increasing collaboration, these increasing bodies where they kind of loop them together as kind of, broader industry alliances. And they start attacking, the carbon tax the first time around. They start attacking other proposals to deal with climate change. They help, promote kind of, doubt and uncertainty about the climate science that makes politicians unnerved to do anything. They help make the public conversation about this so fundamentally toxic that nothing happens. And that's been the game ever since.
And if people are kind of curious about other ways that manifests, check out GESERA at the CSIRO. This is gas, not oil, but it's the Gas Industry Social and Environmental Research Alliance. And it's between the CSIRO and the 5 biggest unconventional gas companies in Australia. And they sit on kind of the research committee for that. And they've been involved in, a lot of hearings about whether or not massively expanding fracking is a very good idea all across Australia, and unsurprisingly, they think it's great. And more recently, I was even thinking you might recall we had Minerals Week put on by the Minerals Council, which really kind of appeared a bit of an all-out war declared on the government from the mining industry. whining about, oh, we're doing it really tough and the government's trying to regulate us and make life difficult. And again, it's that idea, not everyone within those industries all gets along. Some of the companies pay lots of tax like BHP, some of them pay no tax like lots of multinational gas companies. And there's no coincidence that they put people like the Minerals Council out the front sometimes and not individual companies or their executives.
And that's another really important point as well that I want to pick up on, because when you go back and look through these documents, right, there's a very deliberate strategy to use industry associations as the shield, because that stops individual companies from being seen to, metaphorically speaking, hold the knife. So if you have to engage in a political fight, if you have a disagreement, you would rather the association handle this rather than individual companies. And these associations also network with their counterparts regionally, so across the Asia Pacific, and also globally, nationally. And when you go back and look at how this, and there was a disinformation campaign about climate change, there was a concerted effort to emphasize the uncertainty and doubt and make people afraid about the idea that if we do something about this, bad things will happen, the economy will blow up, the sky will fall, and it will all be terrible. But that was coordinated through these industry associations as one briefs the other, like a kind of series of Russian dolls. And so that has always been the kind of strategy.
We talk a lot, and the book examines a lot, obviously, that revolving door and influence on government. But there were two other elements that I found deeply shocking and appalling. One is that kind of greenwashing that happens with sectors that have a lot more cultural cachet and investment from the community, like the arts industry, for example. And you talk about the beloved author Tim Winton and his kind of trying to stand up against gas industry sponsorship of cultural institutions in WA.
Yeah, so Tim Winton gave an incredible speech where he called out a bunch of cultural institutions, and basically the call from Tim and others was for divestment and disassociation. So stop taking the money and stop being nice to these people at parties, essentially is what the call is. And that creates, that changes the landscape and makes different political actions possible. But, and Tim gave this great speech, and he was only wrong about one thing, which is that he said that big oil is borrowing from the big tobacco playbook, but the reality is actually the reverse. Big oil taught big tobacco how to engage with the media, how to do these strategies, and big tobacco just went and perfected it. Now, but this is another really significant element of this, because when we talk about lobbying and influence, and when you look back at these old industry documents, and they're quite plain about this, I found an explanation of this in an old gas industry journal. The difference between power and influence. Power is like the ability to issue sanctions to so if you're a parking inspector, you have power to impose a sanction on someone. Influence is like the queen. She has no power, but she has influence. And that's what these people were actively seeking to cultivate. And there are ways to do that is direct, through donations, through direct meeting with lobbyists. But there are indirect ways, there are soft ways of doing this. And that is to shape how we think about ideas, how we imagine what is possible from the world. And in order to do that, there was a concerted effort from industry to focus on schools, to focus on universities, to focus on art spaces, to focus on sports, because they knew that those are the things that people liked, wanted to be around, were involved in, or community groups as well. And it was a way to shape how people think and feel about the world around them. Because if say a big company, like to use William Walkley as an example, he was the guy that founded Ampol, that helped discover oil in Australia. He sponsored everything that moved. And he did that knowing that if he spread a little money around, no one's going to criticize him. No one's going to say he's a bad guy because he sponsors the local sports team. And then on top of that, there was a fantastic industry a document from the Tobacco Industry Archives that you can find that lays out the logic of this. If you have a sports sponsorship, if you have an art sponsorship, say you have a politician you're trying to befriend, you can invite them to the game. You can give them a corporate box. And while you're hanging out watching the game, you can do a little business. Or alternatively, you can let them address the crowd at the start of the game and put that one politician in front of an audience of 80,000 people. And that's huge for a politician. And the tobacco industry credited their sponsorship of NASCAR with defeating a tax proposal in one of the US states. And likewise for arts, if the person you're trying to befriend isn't really a big sports person, you can take them to the, like the symphony orchestra. You can take them to a play. You can take them to a gallery opening that you've sponsored. And so there's this entire, it's this fascinating world where, this level of influence spreads through kind of, in some ways, all facets of Australian life. And so part of the book was to highlight that, to get people to think about, okay, what are we doing this and why are we doing this? And is it worth rethinking this?
I'm going to come soon to questions from the audience, so please put your thinking caps on for questions for Royce. But I've got a couple of other things I wanted to get to. One was, tell me more about the schools, because that was one of the most rage-inducing bits of the book for me. And I just hadn't really clocked how kind of far tentacles reach and how much of a target that was. And partly because they know how toxic they are as an industry, and they're actually genuinely having trouble recruiting young people into it. So why are schools kind of been a target, and how are they infiltrating schools?
Well, and there's a bit of a story here as well. So when you have industry is always targeted educational institutions. There's some reasons. If you're an oil or gas company, you need petroleum engineers. So you need, so you give a donation to a university to set up a program, et cetera, et cetera. But so you had all these kind of individual programs from companies. You can do it to buy a social license. You can give the local school kids a tour of your refinery operation, or, you can show them some stuff about whatever else. But for the most part, it was always haphazard, isolated, individual, one company cares about this, another company doesn't, whatever. The 90s roll around and and things start to change. And there is a very deliberate decision made to attempt to set up a schools program that is coordinated, that is targeted, and that is dedicated towards getting oil companies into schools around the country, getting materials into schools around the country. And this, and essentially it sought to knit together all these individual programs these companies were running and kind of really turbocharge it. And they did this by having a science teacher who was on a kind of work to industry program come work with the Australian Institute of Petroleum for a while, and basically draw up how to do it, because she knew how to talk to schools. She knew how to write curriculum. She knew, what kind of materials teachers would use. She knew that teachers would get tired and just look for something really helpful that would help them, do their research. And so I found I found the speech she gave at the national conference of that particular year, in I think it's 1993, 1994, where she lays out very explicitly that this is a function of the industry's public relations arm, that they are deliberately trying to get into schools, that they're going to target this, and she lays out all the ways in which they're going to do so. And they start producing materials. And their focus at that time was not on the university sector, where they already had a presence, but specifically on young children. And so they produced this one example is they produced this incredible book called The Big Book of Oil and Gas. It's exactly like you imagine a children's book to be. It's big, it's colorful, it's pink, it's got silly little dinosaurs on the front, but then you read it and it tells you all about oil and gas. But what it does is it primes the reader to not imagine a world without oil and gas. It primes them to think about gas and oil and gas as essential. It is essentially kind of propaganda targeted at the youngest minds. And what's very funny about this is that I also found a photo of our former Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, at the launch of this book here in Canberra, reading it with a bunch of school kids and looking kind of confused by what he was reading. Very interesting image. But this program, and for me, the bigger picture on this is it was remarkable to find this material, this document, right? Because the scale of the intent was beyond anything that I was aware of, that anyone I knew was aware of, and it was audacious in its honesty. But I guess the footnote to the story, the ending to it, is that that program specifically fell apart when the internet rolled around and computers started getting into the schools. And by the way, the oil industry was really quick about computers. They immediately created computer CD-ROMs with programs to for kids to look at. I think it was Petromania was the name of it. And I'm desperate to find a copy of the CD-ROM. So if any of you happen to know any out there, I'll appreciate the hookup. But once the internet rolled around, it basically allowed teachers who were stressed, were overworked, had too much to do, and had to teach earth sciences to go online and just download stuff anonymously without having to talk to anyone, without having to engage with anyone, without having to pick up these resources directly. You could just download the worksheet, and even today you can find them online. The one I'm thinking of was out in Western Australia, and if you look at what it says about the greenhouse effect, it says that we should all be thankful without it, life on this planet wouldn't exist. It doesn't say anything about climate change. It doesn't say anything about oil and gas extraction or the level of CO2. It just says scientists think there might be a problem, and so that's that's where we're at.
Towards the end of the book, you get into some of, obviously, the community backlash, and in particular, the wave of or the impact of the wave of anti-protest laws that we've seen state governments pass pretty much all around the country. And you talk about Violet Coco and the prosecution of her and how some of how that unfolded, I guess, and in the context of kind of really crackdowns from state governments in particular to try and crack down on protests in general, and it was kind of happening all around the country. And, we're potentially heading into a lot more extreme weather that does tend to make people want to protest when they experience it, and those kinds of things like the Lismore floods that saw not long after the bushfires, people really feel those impacts for a long time. It takes a long time for communities to get back on their feet. I'll never forget when that family travelled, to dump the ashes of their house on the lawns of the Prime Minister's house. So I'm really interested in some of those reflections that you had on the book about anti-protest laws and their functions and how they've been applied.
Yeah, so I mean, if you read the book, there's several stories of people who are involved in these campaigns, because I was talking to everyone involved and I was covering these things. Violet Coco being one, but there were a few others. And I think the key thing is that a lot of the people in the book are young people. They're people in their 30s. They're people who have lived their lives in a world where a series of decisions were made before they were even around, and they are living the consequences, and they're watching another set of decisions being made while they're alive that they're going to have to continue to bear the consequences of. And so a lot of people find themselves frustrated. They find themselves, and they want to do something. And part of what they do is activism, is put themselves in situations that are risky. They risk arrest. Like, a couple of days ago, we saw people stop a coal train going towards Newcastle after the approval of those 3 coal mines. So, I use the example of Violet Coco, but there were hundreds of these protests. There's many of them. They've been going on for years. There's some of them are big, some of them are little. But what we saw that was remarkable, and Violet Coco was a good example of that, is the attempt to use the machinery of the state to repress those protests, to stop them, to make the war damn annoying. And Violet Coco kind of exemplified that with her case, because when she was arrested, she did the protest. She did it on Sydney Harbour Bridge, holding the torch, blocking traffic, one lane of traffic, not all, as the police alleged at the time. And the case that was ran against her was kind of exaggerated. And ultimately, this went through the courts process, and there was some real shenanigans about that. And I was there on the day of the appeal. I reported on it. And when it finally came to the crunch, when it finally came down to it, the police were forced to admit that the ambulance that they claim existed, because they claimed that in doing this process, she stopped traffic, which trapped an ambulance with some under lights and sirens with someone in the back, that was stuck in traffic. That was the principal reason why she was originally given jail time. But the police had to admit that they made it up. There was no evidence. And once the judge found that out, he was furious because they wasted everyone's time. What should have been a minor penalty had become much more serious based on this fact, a false fact, as it was called. But this motif, this idea of the ambulance in an emergency situation, under lights and sirens, racing to the rescue for someone, this emotive feeling has popped up elsewhere. It also occurred in South Australia, where the anti-protest laws there were rushed through in the space of, I think, 4 hours, 5 hours to the lower house. And again, I was there, and I closed. And what was remarkable to me is that I was there at the time. I was at the oil and gas industry's national conference that day down the road as this was unfolding. And I got a text message from someone saying, hey, by the way, have you seen this? And it's literally what was going on in Parliament. And I walked down the road into Parliament House for the press conference about these laws. And the state government had been in a secret meeting for an hour beforehand, hashing out how they're going to do this. And by the way, the idea for these laws began on talkback radio, and they were hashed out over talkback radio before it made to Parliament. No one was consulted. No one, there was no, seeing how this would affect the right to protest. There was no questions asked. It was just written up and passed. And then, as this was unfolding, I asked the Attorney General during the course of that press conference, was there an ambulance? What evidence do you have that there was an ambulance? And the response was, well, it stands to reason if you stop traffic that near-ish a hospital, there might be an ambulance. And I had walked past that protest when that had happened, and there were multiple lanes of traffic open, and the tramway, which would allow access, which is a moot point. But I asked again, so there is no evidence that there was an ambulance, and the same response happened. And so so that was another example of these kind of very repressive laws passed to target the people who want to do something about this, and who have very real, genuine concerns about what has happened, and punishing people. And I believe in New South Wales, the laws were overturned here on appeal. Some of the lawyers in the room could let me know. I can't remember that. Yes, getting nods. Hasn't happened in South Australia yet. So those laws, which are twice as heavy as what was in New South Wales, are still on the books. But we're seeing that around the board. And by the way, this also differs where you are in the country. If you're in Western Australia, there are no anti-protest laws being passed. They're just relying on the police, the terrorism police, to basically go and follow people around, the State Security Investigations Group. So I think that is a very interesting and potentially alarming trend going forward. This tendency, this desire by politicians who are feeling political pressure, who are feeling pressure from business groups to want to use force, to use the law to respond to what is a political problem, which is this lack of action on climate change, rather than addressing the fundamental problem. Because ultimately, if we address the problem, those people are going to go away. They have lives, they have families, they would rather be at home with them, they would rather be earning some money than dealing with this.
And that idea that they can just kind of call upon, the state to intervene on their behalf, and it happens within 5 hours. Like, can you imagine if Australia's nurses had that kind of power, what kind of a different community we would have?
Well, and we also saw with one of the industry conferences, it was a general mining conference, but it appeared to be the case that they shifted the venue for the conference from Melbourne to New South Wales when those laws were passed. And so what that seemed to be, and I say seemed because there's no positive proof yet, was an example of jurisdiction shopping, where they moved to the jurisdiction they thought was going to give them the most heavy-handed police presence, which tells you something significant, I think, about how the strategic decisions are made in this space.
And I mean, this is a bit of a left field example, but I was even just thinking the other day about how, you go into Coles and Woolies now and it's all bloody self-serve checkouts, and they don't employ people anymore to do groceries. And then they complain that people are stealing too much and they want the cops to come and enforce shoplifting stuff. And you're like, you used to employ people to do all this, and now you're like the police, like it's a completely inappropriate response. And corporations trying to use their, get the state to intervene and use their power on their behalf. No one has lined up yet, but does anyone have a question for Royce that you would like to come up and ask? He will be signing books just after this, so if you've got your copy or if you don't have one yet, you can purchase one. But please, if you've got any questions, I've got more, but I'm conscious that you guys might have them as well. Please, first question.
Hello. I saw a documentary on SBS last night about the London smog in 1952. And one of the things that struck me about that was the massive cover-up that the government undertook to downplay the number of deaths. And because there wasn't really an anti-coal lobby, coal played a massive part in that smog, there wasn't really that same concept back then, so there wasn't really that kind of influence on the government, at least that didn't come through in the documentary. So their eagerness to downplay the number of deaths seems to me to have come out of an idea of for them to want to seem to be in control or want to avoid blame. To what extent does that play a role in how we see governments respond to climate appeals from people to sort of do something about climate change now?
Look, very good question, and also it's the same instinct, because if you it's by controlling the information, you're attempting to control the public response to those situations, and we see, and it's entirely the same now when it comes to climate change, when it comes to these sorts of situations. You see it with the reluctance to talk about climate change directly. So you see it now with the reluctance to talk about climate change directly. You see it now with the reluctance to run timely attribution studies to show that one event was directly linked to climate change, which, to the best of my knowledge, at the time of writing the book, the CSIRO had yet to do an attribution study that would link that event to climate change, which made it impossible to report on it. But then there was another organization in the US that did. You see, and so that's the political aspect of it, because if people were aware that there were lives and livelihoods on the line and the extent of that, and even to another example, the cost of modeling. So when we have modeling about the effects of climate change, the modeling is always about the cost to the economy for making the transition, but not the cost of saved by helping to reduce these kind of massive disasters. But there's also a legal component to this as well, because if you start acknowledging that there is a cause and effect between these things, you start opening yourself up to legal liability, and that's bad for business. I mean, for instance, the Australian gas industry was aware in 1970. I'm going to get the date wrong, but it was about 1972-ish actually. Don't quote me. Rough guess. They were aware that burning gas indoors caused breathing problems, and they were afraid that fact would stop the massive expansion that they were planning for their industry. And so that's always been the game, is to muddy the waters, ensure that the right facts get to the right people, and to an attempt to delay those actions as long as possible until it's someone else's problem.
Next question. Hi, I'm Tanya. Thank you very much. Really interesting context you're laying out, because it certainly does give the fuller picture of how insidious and how slick, in fact, these actors are. So I really love it. Got it. I think for all of us in the room, there's probably a strong sense of the problem. I guess, and I haven't read the book, full disclosure, but I intend to. And I'm just wondering if you lay out a solution, because I think we're all experiencing the frustration and the damage, particularly in Australia, of these long-term climate wars. It's playing out not just in terms of climate change, where I think we are starting to see less denial, more action on the net zero front, but less so on the nature positive protecting environment front. And I'm just wondering, this particular government right now, it came to power promising to do things on net zero and on nature positive. You just spoke about the minister's actions this week. There's clearly, political determination at the beginning of this particular cycle to try and do something. They've clearly not been able to. What's preventing them? What's the solution on the way forward if you've got a really committed government that's trying to turn back 10 years of decadal decline and natural disaster, basically, and still can't? It's obviously insidious. It's obviously got the hook into the public as well, and how do we fix that?
Big questions. There are two parts to this. The first is that in my capacity as a reporter, I have had the great privilege of being able to cover. I'm a reporter. I'm not an activist. I'm not a legislator. I can't tell people how to solve things like that. But I have had the privilege of covering the people that are trying to do that. And what I will say is that I think it was Max Weber who said that the change is like boring through thick boards, right? Like it feels like you're doing nothing and nothing and nothing and nothing, and then suddenly the thing breaks and everything changes. And I think there are a lot of people out there doing a lot of good things, whether it's, again, divestment campaigns in their universities, in their schools, and like nippers clubs, things of that nature, right up to people working kind of behind the scenes in kind of, government departments trying to do the right thing. There are people trying to do that stuff. It's very hard when you're working on the thing in front of you to not see that overall picture, because things are changing. I mean, you have South Australia running on 100% renewable energy. You have and Tasmania, and so you have these kind of signs of something shifting. The issue is about, well, how fast should we be going, and how do we make that further? Which is the second point. Politicians are fundamentally looking for a way, like they're constantly worried about what the public will authorize them to do, and I don't have any special line inside the current government. I don't know what's making them tick across the board. I have observations, but that's another thing. But what I suspect has happened is that the government is desperate to avoid a fight. They are desperate to avoid a fight with industry, and industry has made it very plain that if you proceed in this manner, we will go you like we did Julia Gillard over the mining tax, and we're going to roll the dice and see where the public lands on this. And the government is also trying very hard to differentiate itself from the Greens, because they seem to have made a calculation that the public is not going to authorize them to act in a way that would address the promises that they made coming in. Whether or not that is true or accurate, I don't know, but that's how they seem to be thinking. And I am curious to see how the public responds at the next election, and whether that costs them because that was a radical miscalculation of the situation, or whether it was on point.
I would also add to that, particularly with the nature positive stuff, there's going to be a big nature positive summit soon, and the Australia Institute obviously does a lot of research into these kinds of things, and we published an open letter with a bunch of other environmental organisations this week, basically calling on the government for regulation, taxation, like ruling out just doing the bad things. Like we're still logging native forests, for example, which, this might surprise you, not great for Australia's threatened species and biodiversity and being nature positive.
Well, and on that, I believe as well that, I think at the last Labor conference, there was a promise made to not do that anymore. And I would be very interested to know what happened to that.
Yes, I would be too. Not much so far, would be my suggestion. But again, like boring through wood until something happens. Both Western Australia and Victoria have ended native forest logging, for example. And my other suggestion is, as people in the public and voters, not to let governments overcomplicate things. So Tanya Plibersek, as the Environment Minister, wanted to create a green Wall Street and to really financialise being nature positive and create a nature positive market. Who is the market for this? Fossil fuel companies, property developers. They're the people that want to buy offsets created from carbon credits. That's creating a whole new market of problems and other things to regulate. And we don't need any of that when the answer to a lot of these things is actually very straightforward, like let's stop native forest logging. So I would say one of the answers is for the public to be aware and to push for governments to do the straightforward things that we know work, and not let them like overcomplicate it too much, would also be my suggestion. Great question, thank you, and thanks for my prerogative as host interrupting there with my own point of view. Next question, thank you.
Yeah, my name's Ben. Thank you for a very interesting talk. My question is about whether you've followed the latest Tenet media, the indictment by the American Department of Justice. So Tenet
on plastics?
Well, Tenet Media is basically just a front for the Russian government, which is funneling millions of dollars to right-wing social media influencers to try and get Donald Trump elected, and also to spread disinformation about climate change, amongst other things. Whether you think that's really just the tip of the iceberg, and whether maybe even big corporations are also getting involved in this sort of covert activity.
Look, okay, so in terms of the Russia stuff, I haven't been following that closely, so I don't know, I can't comment specifically about that. What I will say is that broadly speaking, at the level of multilateral diplomacy, which is where all good ideas go to die, Russia is one of a number of big fossil fuel producing blocs that has played a very interesting game in terms of how it engages with those processes, because it obviously relies on gas as extraction. It obviously relies on oil extraction. It is one of the world's biggest producers of this up until it decided to invade its neighbor in some kind of weird strategy. So I would be thoroughly shocked if they weren't trying to support that viewpoint. I mean, when I was at COP28, for instance, there was a massive story that broke where the head of OPEC was encouraging, people to kill that treaty. Also, there were some kind of shenanigans going on with kind of more Western blocs as well, but who are big oil-producing nations. But that's another conversation. The other stuff about corporate influence, yes, absolutely. I think there is corporations, and we know this. I mean, it's well documented. I talk about it in the book. Attempts to do kind of surreptitious influence campaigns through social media and the like. And we saw this with kind of through the disinformation campaign on climate change. There was an attempt to wash these ideas through think tanks, and then when the internet came around, to put this on the internet so that this idea gets like self-seeded and just becomes part of the popular discourse, even though there's no basis to it. There was a very concerted campaign to do that. And within Australia, that goes back to the 70s. I quote a letter from the guy who founded Santos talking about how no one listens to business guys because everyone just writes them off as business guys. They need to get creative about how they go about it. So, I mean, I would not be surprised if that ended up being the case.
And I'll just say for the Australians, we got none of that sweet fossil fuel think tank money, unfortunately. No, independently funded. Thank you very much to our supporters. And thank you for your question. We've got two more questions here. If you want to ask them one after the other, because then we might have to wrap up. So I'd like to get to both of them. Thank you.
Well, look, mine will be really quick. I haven't read the new book because it only just arrived, thanks to Booktopia.
Those scamps.
It's a common theme in your books, looking at the implications for an individual human from a political decision. Do you think there's any way to increase sort of the awareness of individual implications and obviously groups of individual implications into the political discourse, or possibly to make it more economically centred rather than grandiose claims being made by our politicians?
Thank you. And then our final question.
Yeah, this may be a little bit more of a comment than a question, but I'm really glad you finished your discussion in the book with the discussion around violet cocoa and activism as a long-time climate activist. And I think it is very important, the discussion around sort of like how we go forward from this. And I think the talk about how the struggle around native forest logging was won is quite important, because that clearly was the activism that made the difference. And in terms of the analogy, about the Weber analogy about boring through layers of wood, I think building a mass movement will be the crucial part, the crucial last turn in terms of boring through wood.
May I ask if you can get to a
question?
question?
Yeah, very quickly. So I really just want to say that if anybody is interested in mass action, I really just want to give a shout out to the blockade in Newcastle on the 22nd to the 24th. Which Newcastle is the largest coal port in the world. The blockade last year had 3,000, and we're hoping for more than that this year. And that's going to be brought to Canberra. And so I'd like everybody to take a leaflet, a Rising Tide leaflet at the back, which actually talks about the Canberra leg of that on the 26th to 28th, when we will be occupying the area outside Parliament and trying to get Albanese to answer the question, when are you going to say no to new coal and new gas? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I guess that takes us back to that question of individual action from the question of before that as well.
Yeah, and look, in terms of how do we get more of the focus of politics and politicians on the individual in a way that recognizes that there is a human cost to their actions? That's a very good question. I don't have a solid answer to it. I think it's incredibly hard. I think if you ask a lot of politicians, they would tell you that they believe that they want to do that that's what they're doing. Again, that's rhetoric. It's not true. Because by nature, by their position, by their job, they are removed from the general public. They're in their own world. It's like I don't want to use the horrid phrase Canberra bubble, which is overused and abused, but there is an element to which that is true, where when you do this job, you are not talking to the people you used to talk to every day previously, because you just can't. How we get that focus back into political discussion, I don't know. I'm a reporter. I'm an author. I write books. Part of what I do is tell those stories. Part of what I do is focus on that, because I believe that is one way to force the focus back onto those people. But the challenge is getting people to listen, is getting people to pay attention, is getting the people in charge to pay attention. And I think that is up to the people in this room. It's up to that's the only way it happens, is to force them to watch, force them to listen, force them to pay attention.
Our executive director, Richard Dennis, talks about the fact that politicians respond to electoral pain or the threat of pain. And I guess I would just have the observation that it can seem like things won't move for a long time, and then you get some big step changes. And at the last election, we saw a bunch of politicians in safe seats with margins, sometimes in the double digits that no one thought could be lost, fall to independents who got elected on the basis of climate action and dissatisfaction with the previous government's record on that. Electorally, I think the last couple of elections show that change is possible at the electorate level, and that people in those particular electorates really voted for change. And that's something that both the major parties, I think, pay attention to, and there has been a long-term decline in the vote for major parties. And the one last thing that I wanted to just remind people of is I think we do have some different people in Parliament, and here in the ACT, we have a senator who has engaged in non-violent direct action himself. David Pocock locked on, I think it was, I want to say in the Pilliga, is that right? Does anyone here know? Yeah. Laird, was it? I can't remember. But, there are members of Parliament who have engaged in that kind of action and might have a different perspective to some of those parliaments that rush through anti-protest laws, for example. But we do have a federal election coming up, and so voting is always one of the most powerful things that we can do in a democracy. So before we get to the federal election, buy a copy of Reese's fabulous book, Slick, Australia's Toxic Relationship with Big Oil.
Smooth upsell.
And please give Royce a round of applause this evening.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much. You can buy copies of the book this afternoon from our wonderful friends at Paper Chain Bookstore Manuka. That's up in the back right near the bar, where you can also grab yourself a drink. Royce will be signing copies of the book, and any questions that we didn't get to, you can ask of him there. I want to thank our friends at Verity Lane Market. We love coming here. It's such a fabulous venue, and there's such wonderful food downstairs. So if you haven't grabbed something, go downstairs and grab yourself some dinner as well. I want to thank all the Australia Institute staff, Hayden, Hannah, Yasmin. If I've forgotten anyone, I apologise, but thank you always for making this a wonderful evening. Thank you all for coming out here this evening. And if I might have one final reminder, we are hosting Jose Ramos Horta at the Sydney Opera House. Tickets are $19.50. You can get them from the Sydney Opera House website. That's on Tuesday, the 8th of October, after the long weekend. It's the 25th anniversary of Timor voting for independence, and it's sure to be an unmissable event. It'll be opened by Bob Carr featuring also closing remarks from Janelle Saffin and a performance by the band Manduko. So please do head on over to the Sydney Opera House website or to the Australia Institute website to grab your tickets for that. Thank you so much for coming out here, everyone. And we'll see you again next month here at Verity Lane Market. Thanks so much for coming.